Good morning. Sirs and ladies and gentlemen, it's great to have you here with us today. Many thanks for joining us, and particularly a warm welcome to those of you who have never been to Santos before, not from the Army. I'm afraid the weather hasn't really cooperated, but hopefully we'll get some chance to see our beautiful site here after the event. We're thrilled to have all of you here with us to really what promises to be an amazing and fascinating day. Briefly, for those of you who don't know about CHACR, we are the Army's own internal think tank. It's a unique creation of civilian academics and military personnel, and we've got a straightforward task of helping to develop and sustain the Army's conceptual component of fighting power. Easier said than done, but we try to fulfill that by a variety of means, by publications, events, roundtables, wargaming, battlefield study tours, providing monthly global analysis snapshots that looks at trends across the world and what it means for the Army and also for wider UK defense. And we just released our latest publication on China, which some top 10 China experts in the UK reflecting on Chinese challenge and what does that mean for the UK. So please feel free to grab some of the copies here. And but my book, please buy it before Christmas. It's great. People love it. Your cousins, your nieces, A-level students, amazing. In terms of our next events for your calendar, you're more than welcome to attend. 7th October, we have a great day of talks on non-Western views of winning. We're exploring what does it mean to win actually in a military context. As you can tell from the names and the individuals, we will look at other parts of the world and their traditions. We have a lecture event on operations in the urban environment. And 31st October, that date is coincident, it's an accident. Price of Paradise, History of Suicide Bombing, and that will be a fascinating day as well. And on 5th December, which is our annual conference, where we bring 12 top-notch experts to talk about what's happening in the world, with an end panel of senior Army leaders reflecting on what does that mean for the Army. Confirmed speakers include Lindsay Hilsum, Tim Marshall, the author of multiple books that a lot of you read, David Patrikarakos, the author of War in 140 Characters, Anthony King, Georgina Wright, who's an expert on Brexit and on relationship with Europe, Commander Field Army, Commander Home Command, Elizabeth Bro, Mark Jalot, who wrote an amazing book called We Need to Talk About Putin, Yu who's an expert on Chinese foreign policy, Sinan Ulgan, who's an expert on Eastern Mediterranean and Southern flank for NATO, and Ali Ansari, an Iran expert. As you can tell from the individuals, it will be a day of exploring global power competition, points of contention for UK and what that might mean for the Army in the future. Today, however, I'm thrilled to kick off this day. It started with a conversation with General Carl Ford and General Stuart Skeets, and under the leadership of Sir George Norton, on the need for gapping the discussions on NATO between those who are at the strategic level and those who are at the operational and tactical levels. A lot of you are deployed, and a lot of you see our orientation towards NATO and its importance, again, for our defense. But I often felt that there's a gap between those of us who get exposed to global trends and strategic conversations, why does NATO matter, and those who are actually deployed forward. So we've created a day full of rich discussions featuring some of our leaders as well as an impressive list of experts to cover different aspects of this conversation. As you can see, what we will really encourage is a discussion between the panelists and you. So during the question and answer time, please, there will be one microphone upstairs, there will be one microphone downstairs. We highly encourage questions of all levels. I know in an event like this, I counted, I think, 46 military stars in the audience. Particularly young officers in our NCOs might be intimidated, but at the same time, please do not be. Please ask a question, raise your voice, challenge our speakers, debate the conversation. Don't make statements, but this is an opportunity to have a great conversation. The classification of the event is public. What the panelists say, what the speakers say on the stage is on record. This will be available on the AKX. You can tweet about it. You can take pictures of it. Feel free to take pictures of mine and tweet about it. But the question and answer times are off the record. So whatever you ask, whatever they say is only for your ears here and to engage with it. So please respect that if you are citing that. And in the unlikely experience of emergency, this is my EasyJet days. So there are the fire exits on the front for those of you sitting in the front. There's 4 at the back. And those upstairs, you could make your way down here. That's your escape route. Without further ado, you won't see me again till the end of the day. We will pretty much follow this schedule. We will start with Angus Lapsley. We're really thrilled that he could be here. And it will be then DSACEUR after him. Angus.
Well, thank you very much, Ziya, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to this event, and thank you very much for inviting me to kick it off. So actually, the first time I visited Sandhurst since I started this job, and I'm sorry I haven't got longer to have a look around, but it's great to see you all here today. In just over 2 months' time, the leaders of NATO, the heads of government, heads of state, will meet in London for a meeting which will celebrate the 70th anniversary of NATO's foundation. Now, looking around the room, I'm pretty confident in saying that none of us were alive when that happened. So, this is basically something that we have grown up with. It's been there all our lives, and it's been the foundation, the underpinning of our security that we've grown up with. So we'll have this Leaders' Summit. There'll be a reception at Buckingham Palace the night before, and before any wags start up, yes, our Prime Minister is invited. And we will get together the next morning to discuss where NATO is and where NATO is going. Now, I was thinking this morning back to a slightly later date, which was November 1989, and I was sitting in my college library. And a friend of mine called Ted came in and said, "Angus, the Berlin Wall's coming down." And as I often did when Ted said things, I said, "Yeah, right." I didn't quite believe it, because that had also been something that I'd grown up with entirely. Now, Ted later started calling himself Ed and went into politics. He's still in politics. Ever since that moment in 1989, people have asked themselves, is NATO still relevant? Do we still need this alliance that saw us through the Cold War? Actually, the experience of my professional lifetime is that question gets answered very quickly. So actually, very quickly in the early 1990s, the need to intervene in the Balkans and address a conflict that had broken out right here in our European backyard proved the relevance of NATO. After 2001, and the attacks on America, we again saw the relevance of NATO as it stepped up as an alliance to help in the war on terror. And I think post-2014 and the crisis in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Crimea, the relevance of NATO has absolutely been brought back to the forefront of our minds. Now, we can discuss about whether we should really have got that message in 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia. But in any case, post-2014, I think there has been a very, very real acceptance around Europe and in North America of how relevant NATO now is. And we make absolutely no bones of the fact at the centre of British government that we regard NATO as the cornerstone of our defence and the cornerstone of what my organisation, MOD, does in terms of planning how we defend Britain from the most serious threats that we face. And in fact, the National Security Council met just a few weeks ago under the Prime Minister's chairmanship, and I can't discuss what we went into in that meeting, but I think I can say that it reaffirmed very, very clearly that Britain's security priority is the defence of the homeland, the defence of our home region, that's Europe, the Euro-Atlantic space, and that NATO is absolutely critical to that. So whatever role you are in now, whatever role you are about to start in your career as military officers, one way or another, NATO is going to be at the heart of things. Where do I think NATO is going? What are the issues that I think it would be great if this event was to explore today? Well, I think post-2014, we have done a lot to restore the credibility of NATO's core role in defending the European space and deterring attacks against us. But I don't think that journey is over. I don't think we have done everything we need to do. I think there is still a way to go to make sure that how we do classic, conventional or nuclear deterrence of Russia is credible, up to date, and evolving all the time. And I would emphasize this evolution point, because kind of almost every 6 months now, something happens on the other side, something happens in Russia that makes us think again about how we are defending and deterring. The most recent example is the collapse of the INF Treaty, which brings right back into focus the missile threat that Russia uses to hold Europe at risk. The second challenge I think we have is to rethink how defense and deterrence works in a world where it's no longer just the conventional threat and the nuclear threat, but actually we face all sorts of other ways in which Russia or other hostile states would try and destabilize us, stop us taking effective decisions, stop us bringing our own advantages to bear. So this is what we call the hybrid space or the sub-threshold competition space. Cyber, disinformation, political interference, use of leverage in areas like energy, etc. And one of the things NATO is doing, but is going to clearly have to keep going much further on, is rethinking how we do deterrence and defense in a world that has become much more complex. I don't think the Russians or anyone else want to fight a conventional war with NATO because they know it would hurt and they might well not win. In fact, they would probably lose. So they're looking to get at us in asymmetric ways, and we have to be smart and adaptive and evolutionary as we deal with it. I think the third set of issues that we absolutely have to think about is how the politics of the European space are changing and how NATO fits into that. There is a lot happening. Britain is leaving the European Union. Turkey is evolving in a way that is perhaps not the way that we would have predicted a couple of years ago. The political relationship between America and Europe is very different to where it was a couple of years ago. And I think we have to work out how we are going to ensure that NATO remains politically coherent and at the heart of how we deal with security issues in Europe. So we need to get the relationship between the EU and NATO right. The European Union is developing a bigger and bigger security role. Much of that is very welcome, but we need to make sure that the areas of overlap between NATO and the EU are properly managed. We don't unnecessarily duplicate or compete with each other. We need to make sure that there is a strong industrial base in Europe in the defence and security sector, and that NATO and the EU don't pull that base in different directions. We need to work out how NATO interacts with the growth of small group and bilateral cooperation in Europe, which is often a very positive thing. For example, the UK leading the JEF group of nations, Northern European, Scandinavian, Baltic nations who are interested in fast-moving expeditionary operations in that part of the world. How does that fit with NATO? So I think there's a bunch of political challenges that we have to get right. And perhaps above all, fostering the sense of community and of shared values that underpin NATO and bring us together. I think there is a lot the UK is going to have to bring to this, and I think this is one of the things I'd like you to explore during the course of the day. I think the UK has a particular role in making sure that NATO stays adaptive and fast-moving. I spent much of my career working with the European Union, and that can be pretty slow and frustrating. But anyone who's worked in NATO knows that it can also be quite slow and frustrating, and that is the nature of any broad-based organisation with almost 30 members trying to reach consensus on things. That's just the way it is. But the UK has a really important role in keeping an adaptive and evolutionary mindset within NATO. And I think the UK is going to have to work hard at maintaining our own position of influence within NATO. It doesn't come without a price. It is not something that we can take for granted. We need to make sure that our best and brightest from the armed forces, from the diplomatic service, from the Ministry of Defence, are pursuing careers that take them through NATO. You don't have to spend your whole career in NATO. You'll go in and out. But you're developing the expertise, the contacts, the understanding that will see us through. I also think there's a question about NATO's focus. There are some things we absolutely have to focus NATO on. There are some things NATO shouldn't get involved in. And there are lots of things where NATO is going to have to share its role with other organisations, in particular with the European Union. And how we work that out is going to be important. So I think it's a really exciting moment to be thinking about NATO. If you're starting your careers at the moment, my very, very strong message to you is NATO will be as relevant to your career as it has been to mine or some of the senior officers here today who also, like me, started their career in the late 80s or the early 90s. I think we will be having this conversation in 20 years' time. NATO is an organisation of the future as well of the past. I'm going to stop there, and fortunately I can't stay for the whole morning because I have to rush back to MOD for a senior strategy session, but I'm hoping there'll be a little bit of an opportunity to exchange some questions and answers a bit later on. Thank you very much.
Okay, the underground narrative questions the political value of NATO. It suggests that after 70 years, NATO has lost its mojo, 70 years old, not 70 years young, that support for NATO is falling, which is true, that NATO is too big and too slow. You know, the story goes that NATO has been undermined by differences between European allies and differences between Europe and America, by doubts over American commitment to Europe, by the lack of European military capacity, by the lack of agility, and even, Washington Post, 19 September this year, by Europe's yearning for neutrality, which tells you that military power is no longer important. You know, my reply, well, I think complacency has always been the curse of our governments and the killer of our men and women, and is best avoided. That we live in dangerous times, and that we are a long, long way from 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the triumph of liberal democracy, and the so-called end of history. I would add that the strategic shocks and aftershocks of the 21st century, and I think we could list probably 10 or 11, all that represent lost certainties, have made life more complicated and unpredictable, with the return of great power competition, the growth of terrorism, and of course the rise of a polycentric world order, with an increase in the number of threats and challenges, hybrid, conventional, and terrorist, which we now face all the time. So it is unwise to take peace for granted, that vigilance is the price of freedom, the military power is still important, and that these threats and these challenges alone, let alone in combination, exceed the capacity of any single nation, certainly of the UK, to manage or resolve. So we certainly should not take counsel of our fears. And when it comes to NATO, a bird in the hand, which is a working alliance, underpinned by a treaty which is a model of brevity and clarity, which gives the US a seat at the European security table, and has kept the peace in the Euro-Atlantic area for 70 years. A bird in the hand is a lot better than 10 in the bush. Yes, change takes time, but since 1949, if you look back at your history, NATO has been an extraordinary instrument for building common purpose between allies. This constancy of purpose has in hard times always managed to overcome the different, often disparate views, sometimes contradictory perspectives that exist between allies. And then finally, like vegetables to a child, NATO is something that is good for you rather than something you have to necessarily like. Why? Because being a true ally is hard work. It can be difficult. It demands constant attention and may require you to prioritize the alliance over national interests. As a result, I would suggests that we in the West, we in the UK, need more NATO, not less. And for the UK, as Angus said, this is even more important in the context of the British exit from the European Union. And as we work very hard to give purpose, structure, and meaning to the idea of global Britain. And I think, global Britain is all about reinvesting in our relationships, championing the rules-based international order, and demonstrating that the UK is an open, outward-looking, and confident nation on the world stage. And the temptation is always to believe that you need change to be better, baby bathwater, when we can and should build on something that we know works and adapt alongside NATO as the cornerstone of our defence. Angus spoke about NATO relevance. Sarah McIntosh, the ambassador at NATO, spoke at Chatham House this May, providing a huge amount of evidence on NATO's relevance. And most importantly, she explained that since 2014, the NATO has once again successfully adapted, as it did following the Cold War, as it did after 9/11, to the more complex security environment and the strategic challenges that Russia and international terrorism present. I would add to the long list of visible achievements that you see that flowed from the Wales, Warsaw and Brussels summits, we've done a lot that you don't necessarily see. We have improved our command and control, strengthened our decision making, and this will be further strengthened when Joint Forces Command Norfolk in the US gets to full operating capability to again regain control of the Atlantic. And when the Joint Support Enabling Command, based in Ulm, again, in this case, to ensure freedom of operation and sustainment in the rear area, reaches full operating capability. NATO has also re-established an indicators and warning matrix that runs from the Konar Peninsula all the way down to the Black Sea, as part of our efforts to strengthen our presence in the East. And with the support of all nations on a monthly basis, virtually weekly basis, NATO is now running a whole sequence of focused collection activities on our northern, eastern, and southern flank. Helped in the south, of course, by the creation of the Hub for the South, that through that framework of Connect, Consult, Coordinate, has increased our knowledge of that troubled area. So, NATO has understanding, and I think this is really important in a complex world where psychological calculations and signalling underpin effective deterrence. If you look at NATO over the course of the last year, a total of just over 250,000 troops have exercised on our eastern flank. NATO has a growing partnership program, not just in Iraq and Afghanistan, but where and when it is needed. And I think exciting that NATO is now working on a new approach, the first concept for the defence of the Euro-Atlantic area since 1967. That will, in time, my language, move NATO away from a reactive case-by-case approach to crisis management to a more proactive, comprehensive approach, a defensive strategy that continually contests the playbooks of our adversaries. This will put us on the front foot, it will regain the initiative, and it will better exploit over time the alliance's strategic advantages. And so, in bottom line, NATO has mass, NATO has reach, NATO has knowledge, in combination, again, that exceeds that of any single nation. Is the UK, and this, of course, is what we strive to be, the leading and most influential European member of NATO? I think the basic facts of the UK contribution to NATO are compelling in terms of our defence budget, the continuous at sea deterrence, and the range and depth of our contribution to the range of NATO missions, operations and activities, of which there are about 12 at the moment. So we have done a lot, and we have a CDS who is very engaged to ensure the UK remain at the centre of NATO decision making. And so you could say that we are there. But I think if you asked many of our allies in Belgium, they would suggest that we are not there, but we are thereabouts. And it's worth identifying why the hesitation and why the gap. Our allies like the fact that in the UK we retain a collective memory of greatness, a memory that still persuades many people on our island, but when there is something in the world that needs to be done, then Britain should be amongst the nations that are doing it. They like the investment in our training, in our high-quality leaders. They like our thinking, they like our creativity. But they would say that we do not, as a nation, think instinctively NATO in the UK. You know, like getting in a car and putting on your seatbelt, you know, we don't instinctively think NATO. Is that easy or is it not easy? I think it is easy. Thinking NATO is easy and even inexpensive. We can come back to that later. So I think we could and we should always think NATO in peace, crisis, and in conflict, across all domains, across all functions, across time, in leading NATO, and message this much more strongly within NATO, until this becomes a habit. And when it does, I think the Crown, you know, the leading and most influential European member of NATO, will be ours, and more importantly, the UK will be stronger and safer. Thank you.